All right, so in this video, we're going to implement our gameplay framework. And the reason we need this is because, like, at the end of the day, we're going to have a lot of stuff going on. Like, we've got to store the number of tacos in the level. We've got to store, like, the health of the player and the score, and potentially even where enemies are and where the player is. And so there's lots of things that need to be kept track of, and also a lot of things that need to communicate with each other, things being actors mostly. And so having a framework within which to do this means that we can maintain kind of a lot of our creativity and our flow later on without having to worry about where do we put something and, oh, we're digging ourselves into like this black pit of, well, it works, but it's never going to be like what I want it to be because it'd be too hard to redesign stuff later on. So what I'd like to do, what I'll probably do in this video is I'll cut back and forth between Paint and Unreal Engine as we implement some of these things, just because it might be helpful to get you to understand why we do the things we do. Another reason we're doing a lot of these things because Unreal Engine is also geared towards networked gameplay, so having multiple people. So we're kind of like, I want to keep that option open to us a little bit. So if you wanted to take Taco Treasures and make it a multiplayer game with like 100 people, you could, if you want to do that. So we're going to like a little bit of over architecting, but not a ton. And through this, I'm also going to hopefully give you just this like kind of basic gameplay framework. So that becomes really locked down in your mind. So the first thing we have down, or at least I think we've got down, is we know about like how to represent. So something we know, like we know how to use Microsoft Paint. We know how to represent. Let's make this large. Players and non-player characters, right? So we kind of know what to do, how to do that. And how do we do that? Well, we have a pawn and we have a character, which we've used both times. And the major difference here is a pawn can be anything you want. And a character generally is going to be a humanoid or something that has two legs. And I should, if I want to be totally correct here, should have indented that, but Microsoft Paint won't let me go back and edit it. Okay, and so that's kind of how we represent players and NPCs. We got that down. What we don't really have down, and we've been kind of like, we've been dancing around this issue, is if we go back and we play and we control our player, it's controlling, it's jumping, that's all working. But remember, if we select this player, we scroll way down to the bottom, we see that we had to auto possess player. And then there's this like other stuff here. And so we had to do that before we started playing, and that's like great for testing, but what if you have more than one player, right? If we only have one player, then we can get around having to do this. But we kind of, like I said, we want to keep the option open to do multiplayer in this. So how then, I guess the next thing we want to see, or we want to talk about, is how to control players and non-players and NPCs. How do you do that, at least in the context of Unreal Engine? So there's this concept of a controller. So you have this thing called a controller, and it controls. And what it can do is really kind of, we have two types. Controller, and then you have a player controller, and then you have an AI controller. So you have these two controllers, right? And a controller is basically an actor, right, that controls, I'm going to try to draw a pawn here, controls a pawn. So a controller is an actor that controls a pawn. Okay. And in the case of a player controller, it's an actor that controls a pawn. That could be a character, right? And the main thing is that there's a real person that's operating the player controller. Hopefully, could be a robot, but it's someone in like meat space. It's somebody that's not digital. An AI controller, on the other hand, is exactly what it sounds like. I mean, an AI controller is, I guess, somewhat of a simulated will that's going to control a pawn, right? So generally, the controls are done through the player controller, right? So the player controller controls the pawn. It's the player is using, and the AI controller controls the pawn that the AI is using. So that's a new concept to us. We don't have a player controller. So if we go back here, you're like, well, we don't have a player controller. Let's make one. So if we go to our player folder here, right click, and then we go to blueprint class. This is kind of working our way down the list of things here. You see player controller. A player controller is an actor responsible for controlling a pawn used by the player. Okay, sounds good. And you see that the networked games player controllers exist on the server for every player-controlled pawn, and also on the controlling client's machine. They do not exist on a client's machine for pawns controlled by remote players. So this is generally because if you are in, like, if you're doing something like you're playing say maybe you're playing like big huge multiplayer game and you've got lots and lots and lots of players here, and maybe whatever 100 of them, 1,000 of them, these players that are all being controlled by people all over the world. Maybe this is one region, and you have another region, and you have all these players here that are in these different places, and then you've got this huge server sitting here somewhere else, and they're all sending zeros and ones, whatever. They're sending a bunch of data, a bunch of binary data is getting sent to and from all of these people. That ends up being so much, it's not good, right? If you're sending absolutely everything. So you only want to send on a need to know basis things that happen, right? So if it's in a very large map or something, and you've got maybe a huge multiplayer game, and you have one player here and he's fighting some other player here, and then you have many kilometers away or entire worlds away, you have two other players that are engaged in the same thing. You don't want to have this player sending data to this player all the time. You don't want to replicate things like all that data that's inside the player controller, because these players don't need to know it. I mean, the server itself can sit here and the server can say, well, based on the rules that I have, I'm going to, when players get close, I'm going to start to send certain amounts of data. And this is generally to keep performance up. It's just not performant to be sending lots and lots of data that's not needed by clients. So that was an aside, but really just to talk about why the player controller doesn't exist on every client machine. And I'm not going to get into cheating either, because again, this is another thing that I kind of tend to think about when designing games like this is, if it's going to be multiplayer, there's certain data I don't want you to be able to have access to, because it could make it easier for you to cheat. So that's, having it not replicated on client machines might be a good place to store things. That aside, let's choose player controller. And it's a blueprint, so I guess I'll still do BP underscore player controller. Okay. Notice it's got this kind of different icon here. Double click it. There's nothing in here. If you look in the player controller here, there's some more details that you may not be familiar with, like camera manager and whatnot. And I'll probably talk about that later. I'll do a separate video directly on that, just because it can be a little bit complicated. But right, and then you have some replication here. Anyway, so creating this player controller. Wonderful. Okay, great. So that's all I want to do with the player controller, is just create it. And now we need another folder, because something else that we need is, if we look, we haven't gone here yet, but if you go to the world settings tab, which is here, select that, you have something called game mode. And I'm not going to select it here, but if you like expand this drop down, you see we have all these like default classes, like player controller class, game state class, everything is none, right? And game mode override is none. So I want us to create a game mode. And so game mode is kind of, there's two kind of concepts around game mode. So our first is really, we have kind of two things. We have like, we have game mode and we have game state. These two things. And quite simply put, game mode exists on the server. Normally has transient, non-transient data. Transient data, which is just a way of saying that the game mode is going to have data that doesn't change that much. And so in terms of what game mode is, it's going to be like definition of the game, the rules, the win condition, things like that. Right, but the more important one is game state. And game state, let's see, game state is basically the state of the game. So it could be things like, the connected players. It could be the score. All right, other things like that. It could be like the number of quests you've completed, players have completed, right? And this is like on the server and all clients. Right. So this actually is, game state is replicated both for all clients and for the server. So it has information on both. All right. So all that said, I think I'll put this at the top. So if you go back to Unreal Engine here, and then content, and here on like the top level, we need to make a game state because we're going to override the defaults that the engine gives us. So choose blueprint. Sorry, I meant game mode. And so just kind of going down the list here. Game mode defines the game being played. It governs the game rules, scoring, what actors are allowed to exist in this game type, and who may enter the game. Its only instance on the server will never exist on the client. You're probably like, Christian, why are you making us do this? Well, because I said if we do this the right way, we still maintain the option of having multiplayer on Steam or something, or even local multiplayer. So I'm going to do BP underscore game mode. I guess that's fine. Okay. And so if we open this up, if you look in the details, we now have all these classes. So that's actually what's interesting to us, is we see game session class, game state class, player controller class, player state, which we haven't talked about, which we will soon, default pawn class, spectator class, HUD class, right? So for game state, we can leave that basic, but here's the one we're interested in, player controller. So we made a player controller, and it's called BP underscore player controller. So we can select that and then compile. And then default pawn class, we have our player character. So we can choose that as our default pawn, right? We talked about that being a pawn, and then save. So what have I just done? Okay, what I have done is created a game mode. And think of a game mode as something at like a very top level. It's something that would exist on the server. It would contain our rules, all sorts of like important things that we don't want anybody else touching, but we want all clients to know about. And now we need to we want to tell our project that we're going to use this game mode. So like right now it just has no game mode associated with it. So if you go to edit, project settings, and then it should be at the top. Yeah. Maps and modes, default maps, game modes, and other map related settings. So it's at the top here where it says default modes, game mode base. We want to now choose our game mode. So BP game mode. And then we see it has these already set, right? Because we set them when we double clicked it. Another thing you might want to do while we're at it here is, if you've been closing and opening your project, you probably know, where's my level? And because it's starting in this default level, this default map, and we want to change this. So for us, it's called sandbox. So I'm going to go ahead and change the editor startup map to sandbox, and then the game default map to sandbox. Great, and then close that. So now, what just happened? So did you notice something? So make sure you're back in details. Let's see if this actually works. Yeah, perfect. So what did I do? I did something terrible. I fell through the world. So I chose auto possess player and I disabled it. So now, and I press play and I'm falling through the world, and now I'm lost. So this is helpful. If you select something in your world outliner, you mouse over the viewport, you press F, and you'll go back. Yeah, and I'm just like kind of spawning and falling. So why is that? I thought I was supposed to have this thing. No. So we can actually delete this, or we don't necessarily need to, and we can add in something called player start. So this class indicates a location where the player can spawn when the game begins. So if we drag that out here, that's a player start. When we press play, we'll spawn there, and we can move around. All right. And what's kind of cool about this, and you'll see we have we still have our camera, so it's inhabiting that same camera that we had. What's kind of cool is that we could add multiple player starts here. So maybe we want, 2 on either side, and then it's just going to pick one, right? Depends on, it's kind of random. Like I'm pressing play and, it's picking different ones. So that's helpful. So now you know how to, a little bit more, hopefully, about the gameplay frameworks. And like now we've taken what was just a, inhabiting a single pawn for a single player, and put a little bit of a framework around this so that we can expand this out and make it more of a full-fledged multiplayer game in the future, or at least start to build our gameplay framework. So in the next video, we're going to go over player state, what that is, and we're going to implement our scoring system. Great.